Welcome to Cinema in the Age of Ideology, a series in which we will explore the greatest films of the greatest ideologies of the 20th century. Beyond propaganda itself, how does cinema as an art form manifest the ideology in which it is circumscribed? This is Communism and Eisenstein, this is National Socialism and Riefenstahl, this is Cinema in the Age of Ideology. For our second episode, we will continue with the early Soviet cinema circle and examine one of Eisenstein's colleagues and friendly competitors, Pudovkin, and his masterpiece, 1926, Mat, or Mother. Another montage theory, this one will explore more the characters and the personality of the revolutionary with the Soviet dialectic in which they are subscribed. I will be joined, as always, by my friend Decadent Perspective, who will help me to analyze this movie.
All right, welcome one and all. Let's get to it.
Just like Battleship Potemkin, 1926 Mother is one of the 1905 Revolution films requisitioned by Lenin. This is just 1 year after the success of Potemkin itself.
So the film starts off with a family in obvious turmoil with itself. The mother is constantly worried for the well-being of her son, but she's also rather tolerant of her husband's shenanigans, particularly his abusive nature. He is seen in the beginning of the film beating the mother in a drunken stupor. And the son, we get from the very beginning, is a rather protective person and a rather caring person. He is seen from the very start that he cares for his mother, and he threatens his dad that he's going to beat him with a hammer unless he just stops beating her to a pulp. And so he leaves and he hangs out with his friends at a bar or a pub, I suppose. And they're all talking about, they're all if I can curse, Virgilius. Yeah, they're just sitting around shooting the shit, and and there's we soon find out that the son is part of a revolutionary Bolshevik group, who are planning to strike, who are planning a worker strike, and the very day that they do this, immediately trouble befalls them, and his group are immediately disbanded, and he has to run away. But his father, his abusive father, catches him, and he manages to get away, but at the expense of his father's health. He is immediately shot, I believe, by the police. And the son runs away, and he, in order to protect his friends and to protect his involvement in the movement of his, he takes a whole sack full of guns and ammunition from his friends, so that they won't find it at his place, and he decides to hide it under the floorboard in his sleeping room, along with his mother's. And the mother, of course, is sleeping while he's hiding it under the floorboard, but she momentarily wakes up and notices him doing something, putting something under the floorboard, and she just decides to check up on it later. She's not gonna she's just tired, just another hard day's work. She just wants to go to sleep. Day after, when she is alone in the house, she investigates what she noticed her son put into the floorboard to find guns, and she is immediately frightened. She cannot believe this. And she knows that this is really big trouble for her son, and she does not want this for her son. She is also very protective of him, and so she decides to keep it hidden, but she's plagued by it. She cannot overcome the fear she has of what might happen if these guns are discovered. And the worst thing that she could have ever thought possible could happen happens. The police show up, and accuse the son of hiding the guns, and they demand that the guns be found immediately, or her son will face harsher punishment. And so, in order to uh, appeal to the authorities, uh, she just jumps right over the floorboard and just takes the guns out of the sack, and here you go, there it is now. Will you please let my son go? No trouble, he was just hiding them for a friend. He had no business with it. She's doing everything she can to protect him. The police don't buy it, of course, and they take him to court. And he arrives. The mother is there, and there's a whole bourgeois class there as well, and the judges and the prosecutors. They're all there, and they're given a rather cartoonish portrayal by the director, of course. And it seems to be a rather kangaroo court, and no one seems to care whether or not this kid is innocent or not. They already seem to have made up their minds. And the mother obviously notices this by the time of the sentencing and accuses the court of being unjust. And she's thrown in jail under contempt of court. And of course, she gets out, and she tells her son that I'll find a way to help you, get you out of here. And and soon afterwards, the son finds a letter from his friends that they are planning an escape for him, and that there'll be another strike, I believe. And so the strike occurs, and of course, a tragedy befalls. Many men are shot, including the mother's son. And as a result, she takes up the red flag and stands against the guards and the police with the flag, with a face with a face of a sort of a serene unity, I would describe. She now knows what her son was fighting for, and she realizes that she cannot deny herself the honor of fighting by her son's side, in unison, not just for a country, but for a quote unquote all peoples, I suppose. And she stands against, and of course, tragedy. There's a tragic end. Of course, she's run over by the horses. Obviously suffering a worse fate than her son. Very painful end for her, but nonetheless, that's how the film ends, and that's the story for you. So let's get started. But what can be said about Pudovkin is not very much that can be said about the man. He was also a practitioner of the montage theory, along with Eisenstein. Although Pudovkin had a much better luck in relating to the cinema viewer in regards to their empathy with the characters, and it's oftentimes it may seem impossible to apply montage theory to character arcs, especially when it comes to propaganda. It seems that with propaganda films, there's one strict demand for the characters to relate to everybody of a certain ideological or national persuasion. And so what propagandists usually resort to are mainly flat characters, characters that are rather bland and empty. It's sort of they just represent anybody, and so they think, and they felt that this sort of approach could help any viewer empathize with the struggle and the ideas and the passions, etc. But what Pudovkin realized and has succeeded so well in this film that we're discussing, Mother, which was an adaptation of a story by Maxim Gorky, another famous socialist realist author. It seems Pudovkin seems to have achieved quite masterfully the synthesis between a character-driven plot and montage theory as it applies to propaganda. We see a lot of times many times he reveals shots of facial expressions, particular facial expressions. He rarely uh, portrays them en masse, just very particular people and very particular faces. And you can tell he worked really hard in choosing the kinds of faces to portray, because all the faces are very unique, very interesting features. Some are asymmetrical, some are very lively, and some are very somber, almost like those expressionist paintings that you see in the early 1920s. And also you also see him reveal shots of hand gestures a lot, because he wants the cinematic viewer, to uh, know, to feel precisely what the person is going through, what they're doing. And sometimes they're pacing, and he shows shots of the feet, and what they're doing with their hands and their eyes, their mouths. Everything is noticed in this film, especially with the main character, which is the mother herself, of course, who has arguably one of the most
Appealing, interesting.
the most appealing eyes in the history of cinema, especially science cinema. One is reminded of Joan of Arc, Carl Theodor Dreyer's Joan of Arc, with the same kind of eyes, the same kind of expression, the same kind of passion, the same kind of worry for her son. And it doesn't portray the Soviet revolutionary ideology in terms of us against them, but rather just us. So he sees it as just we, the people, not just we are against them or things like that. It mainly shows. I couldn't think of it. The film hardly shows anything, reveals anything about the bourgeoisie and the czarists. There's really any moments we have with them as a viewer, and there's and so in that case, I just think Pudovkin really showed great potential in what he had to come, and he also had a great eye for nature. The brilliant shots he shows of people toiling their labor amidst nature and gardening. You see children playing, you see horses drinking, and men toiling, and women sewing as well. And it's just he shows a sort of brotherliness in them, and I think he's subtly trying to tell that from that comes the unity within Soviet revolutionary thought. And I think that was a wonderful way to do it, and much more successful way to do it than, at least to me, compared to Belcher Potemkin, say.
Certainly, in the end, we are looking mostly at another interpretation of the montage theory that Pudovkin learned from Lev Kuleshov, which he learned along with Eisenstein himself, which is called, in conjunction, the Moscow Film School. So, a contrast with Eisenstein, which is the same theory but different application, is that Pudovkin relied on something he called iron scripts, in which he would actually make the montage a priori. I mean, he would make the montage in the script, which is really interesting. It's almost like the modern process of storyboarding, in which you actually make the frames and even the contrasts on the script, on the storyboard. Eisenstein, what he would do was to make the montage a posteriori. I mean, after everything was planned, he would see how to connect the predetermined symbols into images. Now, it is also very interesting, the shift or the change in focus that Pudovkin uses, which, as you said, Decadent, is on the individual, or not individual necessarily, but on the personal. You actually don't see the manifestation, the mass manifestation, the public movement, right until the very end. All of the story, all of the film is pretty contained on just the accidents and the vicissitudes that the family survives and lives throughout the film. It's basically the story of that family, of that particular mother, which is very interesting. The particular, not the general, which is seen in Einstein. And indeed, the very end, it's a transcendence from the particular to the general, but just at the very end. So we can affirm that it is a particular, an individual story, which is very interesting.
Yeah, well, even at the very end of the film, the last shot of the mother holding the flag, an excellent shot, one of the most beautiful politically driven shots that I've ever seen in regards to politics as it relates to cinema. You see a piece in her face that you never see before, because throughout the whole film, her facial expressions are rather either scared or
Pathetic in general.
yes, and it's constant fear, constant worrying, as any mother would for her son who's just been jailed and sentenced to extreme labor by the Tsarist government. And but at the very end, you see that shot, and she almost becomes rather saintly, almost godlike in a way. That
Indeed.
yeah, it's like a kind of like a spiritual, like a sort of zeitgeist manifest in a way. And it was an excellent ending shot, that really shows Pudovkin's genius already in his contribution to not just Russian cinema but world cinema.
Indeed. And that's the purpose of the final shot and how the film is constructed, because it is still montage theory in the likes of Eisenstein. But for example, Pudovkin said himself that he tried to affect the spectators not by the psychological performances of an actor, but by the plastic synthesis through editing. So how is it that we can talk about the serenity and the sainthood attained by the mother in the end of the film? It is by the contrasts we make in the final shot with the previous shot the mother had of just this continuous sadness and distress. And if you look carefully, you will see that Pudovkin actually makes shots of the character, but that are not centered on the face, as you had said, Decadent. And there's some moments in which you only see the feet or the hands. Again, this synthesis. But this is very interesting because this is not something that is usually done or was usually done in cinema.
Indeed, and a lot of French filmmakers in the '60s, I think, grabbed hold of that, especially the likes of Robert Bresson. If you look at Robert Bresson's filmography, he portrays the movements of hands and feet, and one's gait and presence through a movement. It was all rather fragmented in its in their shots. That you didn't see the whole frame. You saw certain movements, certain reactions, certain things. It was all limited to just these people, and that the setting was at best rather secondary to what he was trying to say, and even the story for that matter. It was really about what it was an attempt to portray a story just through the gestures alone, almost like ballet in a way. I think Bresson himself even described his actors not as actors but as models, and I think Godard once described his actors as like dancers in a way, that they would just have certain movements just for a certain shot, and he would do takes in again and again and again just to get the right movement, the right the right twitch, the right timing, the right rhythm. It was all very specific, and I think and he took that from the Germans as well, and the German filmmakers. Fritz Lang, for instance, he's another one, and Hitchcock too. He grabbed a lot from that kind of style as well. You know, the gestures and reactions, certain expressions, and you really see how this turn, especially from silent cinema to sound cinema, you see this shift in, especially in the artistry of filmmaking, and auteur, like film auteurs as they call it, uh, try to focus more on those sorts of things, which I think had a very interesting transition, especially in the 60s.
Now, I think that this film should have the prize of being the socialist realism film per excellence. Unlike Potemkin, which also ascribes itself to socialist realism, this film has more of the realism in its nature than Potemkin. In fact, Potemkin seems most romantic and extremely idealistic than Mother. And in Mother, you can really feel all the grittiness, all the suffering right in your eyes. I mean, that's a purpose, right? But the way, even the nature of the story, but also the way in which everything is shot and constructed from the script itself, it's another genre by itself. Now, Pudovkin is independently also a film theorist. He wrote a very famous cinematography book called Film Technique and Film Acting. And this is a very influential book. For example, my favorite director, Stanley Kubrick, has very interesting quotes about him reading that book. So let me mention just two. Kubrick says, "The first really important book I read about filmmaking was The Film Technique by Pudovkin. This was some time before I had ever touched a movie camera, and it opened my eyes to cutting and montage." And he also said, "The most instructive book on film aesthetics I came across was Pudovkin's Film Technique, which simply explained that editing was the aspect of film art form which was completely unique and which separated it from all other art forms."
Indeed, it really is the editing that puts it all in place. I mean, the whole film flows so easily. It's very easy on the viewer's eyes, unlike Potemkin, where it's just extreme shot after extreme shot. It's rather jumbled up. It's like how you said, the process of how he filmed the story of Potemkin. But yes, Pudovkin was really one of the first great masters of the editing technique, and one of the first to place such an importance on that. Usually, it was just show and tell kind of thing, but for him, it really was like there was an importance to a rhythm to it, like a composition, and he saw it that way. He really saw it as something to really excel in regards to how it told the story, and that's the most important thing, especially in its in this particular film's success in Soviet propaganda. It really is how the story is told, not what is told, which is unfortunately the case with a lot of propagandistic films and a lot of propagandistic literature, etc. It's always about the content, not how the content is portrayed or why one should feel related to such contents. And in the beginning of the film of Mother, you see that the family, the mother and her son and the father, are living in hard times. The father is drunk, the son just gets in trouble all the time, and the mother is always worried. And you from the very get-go, you see these characters, and you wonder, and you sympathize with them. You sympathize with the situation, and you feel sorry for them, and you want to see them, and that's the most important thing. From the very start, Pudovkin makes you want to see these people in a better situation and to really hold their own for their own lives, and that's just the beauty of Pudovkin right there.
Yeah, something about the technicality and how Pudovkin constructs his film is the usage of superposition, because we don't see almost anything of that in Potemkin. And he uses this at least three very important moments. The first moment that I can recall is when the son hits some weapons in the house of the mother, his home, and the mother just cannot stop imagining the presence of the weapons, and in some instances the plank on the floor, which is hiding the weapons, dematerializes, and there's a superimposition of images in which we see the floor, then the blanket which covers the weapons, and the weapons themselves, which is really interesting. And just to be short, right at the end, we also see another superposition of images of the mother, and the flag and the revolution, but also this interesting like coming of the background into the foreground, which is the images of the factories, and in the end of the Kremlin itself, which is, I mean, the seat of power for Russia. But this is something really interesting, which gives to the fluidity of the film, but which is in a way allegorical. We don't see anything of that in Eisenstein, which is more almost material. If, for example, Eisenstein makes a metaphor, for example, the sailor which cracks the plate, give us our daily bread. He makes that allegory, but there is no superimposition of images. There is no external symbolism. It is just I want to say materialist. I'm going to say not necessarily simple, but almost superficial. The symbology is there, but it's material and superficial. On the other hand, with Pudovkin, we see this connection of images which really don't stand much apart if you really look at them individually. So it is the same montage theory in which we have two indifferent images to create a very meaningful whole, but really more abstract, more apart. And that's really interesting. And the last scene I recall, which is more or less in the middle of the film, is when spring comes and the sun is in prison. So we actually have these shots that in some moments are superimposed on the shots of the film of the child, of the son in prison, which are the shots of the people and the village in spring. And there's also this superimposition of the fluidity of the water, of the breaking of the ice, which is this allegorical superimposition. It's just another application of the montage theory, which is the very same of Eisenstein's.
Well, obviously, the film places an emphasis on the collective through the individual. It's a technique that's been used in a lot of propaganda throughout the ages. But what's most interesting about Marxist ideology in Mother is it shows it doesn't necessarily demonstrate the economic divisions, but it shows mainly the personalities which stem from the economic the differences in economic class. You see a rather poshness and superficiality in the bourgeois, the sort of emptiness and rather ignorance of situations around them. And even in the court, this is actually most prevalent. The court scene is most prevalent, where throughout the scene, there are like shots of the Tsar, of the statue bust of the Tsar. And that's to imply that the Tsar is behind the injustice of the people manifested in the courts. And you notice that throughout the film, it really is a sort of communicative effort and a collective effort to not just only liberate each other. And it's sort of a duty to do that, to liberate one another from the tyranny of the capitalist industrialist thing. Although these are not necessarily explicitly shown in the film, again, it's mainly shown through the personalities of the characters. That the divisions are much deeper than just an economic difference in terms of labor.
It's also very interesting how Pudovkin uses the scene of the court, of the trial, when he actually names the judges. For example, the first judge is named Righteousness, and we actually have a very indecisive, very destructive man looking forward, back and forward to the sides. Then we have the judge Justice, and he's asleep. And finally, we have the judge, Mercy, and you see this austere man just seated upright and looking directly to the camera with this expressionless face. I mean, this is really the art of deconstruction in its purest. It is, as we said in the previous film, it is beyond critique. It is deconstruction. It is Soviet delegitimization in a really interesting way. Even before we see the judges, their names and the contrast of their expressions, the way the characters are constructed is of these uncaring and pompous personalities, of an almost buffoon-like character construction. So they're in a state of indifference, but also of a self-centered, like in a state of comfort, which is in direct contrast to our main characters, which are in a state of distress. The trial scene is the shifting moment of the film, in which the mother really starts to gain her consciousness, the son is put in jail, and the authorities are delegitimized, which is basically all of the Marxist dialectic moving forward on that specific moment. And that specific moment is really specific because, as Decadent said, we have these shots of the Emperor Nicholas at the moment when the judges are passing sentence. And we see this, as we said, this superposition of images with the words of the sentence and the emblem of the Tsardom, which is basically to say this symbol equals injustice, simply put. We also see throughout the film this dual construction. Like there's this duality emanating from the characters. For example, in the family itself, we have the mother, which is oppressed in an almost patriarchal feminist way. We see the father, who is the oppressor and who is a drunkard. And we see the son, who really doesn't have much power, but he has the what we will say revolutionary elan to fight oppression, specifically in a moment in which he almost attacks his father with a hammer.
I think this also might be a contribution to Friedrich Engels in his work on the family, that under the capitalist industrious czarist regime, the family cannot sustain itself, whereas under revolution, it need only unite itself against the struggle of the oppression.
Yeah, in that way, the family, or what's left of it, is united in the very end, when the son embraces his mother. Or rather, it's the other way around. The mother embraces her son finally, because he accepts him as a revolutionary, because she's a revolutionary herself. It's a totalitarian concept, which is necessary in this context. But pertaining to the duality of the film, we see the older figures juxtaposed to the younger figures in this contrast of old Tsarist, Ancien Régime conservatism, and this young, energetic, revolutionary elan. All of the revolutionaries are young people, and all of the oppressors and Tsarists are old people. For example, we have this scene in which the father is killed by one of the revolutionaries. When the mother is mourning the father, we see old women from the village also mourning with her. And one of these, specifically and on purpose, very, very old woman tells tells the mother that this is the fault of her son, that he's a troublemaker and he will bring nothing but trouble to him and others. That's the point. That's the point of the duality, to destroy the old world to bring about the new world, the old and the young. There's also little moments of contrast between the classes. For example, at the trial, in which we see a bourgeois family that is just observing indifferently the trial. For example, they just point out back into the rows and says, "Who's that there?" "Ah, it's the son's mother. I mean, the mother of the accused." And she's looking just as she looks on all throughout the film, this sad, dead face.
Yeah, it's
But
yeah,
also,
a really, really dead face. I mean, it's the kind of face that you just want to go up to her and say, "Are you okay? Do you need something?"
yeah,
Because damn, like cheer up, chin up, please.
yeah, but if you look at the frame, she's alone on the bench.
Mhm.
She's alone on the court bench, and this is very interesting because if you see the frame, you would see that it is portrayed with the lines of the bench. So in a way, it is like framed in a cadre, in a sort of square. In so the effect of loneliness is amplified there by how the bench is shot, because you could easily made a shot which is closer, uh, first plane, but no, it is more like a general plane, which you almost see her feet. Why is that? It is to portray this loneliness and the lines of the bench. It's also very interesting how one does portray the lines in a movie. Lines can make a lot of difference, and how and from where the lines are pointing to. Here we have parallel lines pointing perpendicular to us. And now that is an effect of almost coldness, but of emotionlessness. Because you usually see, I mean, not a contrast of that lines, not those lines, when we have emotion moments, when we have the moments of pathos, when we have the moments of love, for example, we don't see those kinds of lines. We usually see curves. And that's a whole theory of psychology of how lines and geometry works on our minds to specifically portray emotions, just as colors do, which is another theory in itself. And that's really interesting in this image, which is contrasted with the bourgeois, which have also these sumptuous and elaborate dresses. And the bourgeois lady who's looking everything to their little glasses like a lady.
Mhm.
And she actually comments and makes a positive comment on the judge. She says that this is a fine-looking man, and we again see the austere, death-looking, sentence-passing judge. So, I mean, indirectly, Pudovkin is making us believe that this lady is on the part, I mean, on the group of the judge. Is one of them, of the old, of the bourgeois, of the oppressors. And this is opposed to the oppressed, which is the mother and the young revolutionary girl who is kind of a love interest for the son. There is a contrast, this moment of serenity with the mother when she's holding the flag, and then the Tsarist run her over with her horses, and we actually see a single frame of her face in pain and agony, almost screaming. It was a very grim face, and you see it for a moment, so it's actually stuck in your head, almost in their subconscious, as the cavalry continues to rampage on the mob, on the riot. So actually, the film has a double contrast with his serenity, then pain, then persecution, and everyone is running, but still the flag holds, and we see it standing on the Kremlin in the end. So that's the 4 times the dichotomy, just right at the last minute of the film. When we are shown the prisoners, the fellow prisoners of the sun, all thinking, all restless, and with a dead hope on their faces. And what actually happens is that we are told that all the prisoners have dreams. And all of those dreams are good dreams. But actually, those are dreams of their past, of who they were. For example, we are shown a prisoner. We are shown the hands of the prisoner. And then we see that he was a farmer. And we see that he was actually reaping the soil of his farm. So we actually ought to believe that all of those prisoners are in the case of the son, and that they are illegitimately put in jail. There's also a contrast of expressions on that scene. Now, this whole way of making propaganda films, specifically on the Soviet ideology, is specifically the contrast of emotions. As we saw with Potemkin, everything arises from emotion, everything arises from a popular arousal. The Soviets do not try to hide this, that it is not really an intellectual movement. It is not really even an idealistic movement. They don't promote it with an ideal, because the elements of the riot, I mean of the strike on the film, are not really touched upon. They're just of a sideline. What is really touched upon is the emotions felt by the son and the mother. In contrast, as always, with the prevailing figure of authority, which are the Tsarist officials. That's exactly how the dialectic must work in order to work. Otherwise, it just cannot function. On that same argument is how Marx said that the Gracchi brothers were foreshadow of the communists, which in reality for us it has nothing to do, but in that context of a specifically pathos-driven ideology, or not laid upon but driven ideology, it works, it is necessary, and it becomes casual and deterministic even. We see this culminating in the final transcendence, which is in a way a spiritual transcendence of the character of the mother, and also a cinematographical transcendence, which is shot beautifully, which, as we said, was the mother holding the flag. Again, how does this happen? How does the mother, which is at the first of the beginning of the film, is uninterested with the revolt, with the revolution, and even at first seems to cower from the revolution to protect her son? Why do we see the mother holding the revolutionary flag at the very end? And not because she believes in the revolution. I mean, she believes now, but that was not her motive. No, it is because her son died. So you see how on this ideology, it is not really believing on the ideology that we are in the ideology. We are dialectically pushed into the ideology as an historical necessity. It was necessary for the mother, because her son died, to become a socialist, which for us that doesn't make sense. How does that happen? No, it happens necessarily in this case because her son died. The pathos and the historical moment drove her to become a socialist. And that's something, for example, when you see liberals argue about socialists, do not really understand. They try to sometimes frame it on an ideological and purely intellectual construction, on a purely intellectual progression and a battle of ideas and a progression of thought. But no, it sometimes doesn't work like that. Sometimes it works just by pure emotion, driven by pure emotion, and the ideology becomes almost secondary in this case. Because, for example, in the film, it is secondary. And yet, it is not an opposition with the ideology. It is necessary for the ideology.
What you just said pretty much reminded me of a rather infamous currently living philosopher, Slavoj Žižek, when he talks about ideology, that we are not necessarily, we do not necessarily have an ideology. We are, in fact, in ideology itself. That's
Yes.
that's such an excellent point that he made in regards to that certain topic, because and how he views cinema. He pretty much portrays it in the same way, in that ideology itself is manifest through these particular actions, particular people's particular stories, that that is not necessarily escapable, and not necessarily inevitable either, but that it is part of what makes these. It is part of what the influence of the individual in terms not only his own dualism, but his dualism against society, which portrays the dialectical materialism, or the historical materialism for that matter, in regards to the idealistic intellectual side, which is merely incidental to what really lies within the ideological foundation, which is, as you said, the emotional aspect of it.
Yes, what we see is almost like a what will be like a trap, like a fatalistic trap, of ideology, because this is in our times most exemplified and obvious with the liberal. I mean, perhaps it's not so obvious for the liberal, but with the liberal it is, because the liberal will not admit that he has or he is in ideology. Yes, and when he tries to analyze everything that is his history, I mean, Western history, for example, he will also make it in this framework, which is, as we said, in a way incorrect, which is not how things actually work. We are mostly thrown on the ideology, and the liberal will not admit that. He will not admit that he has been thrown into an ideology and what he would say a bias. He will be blind to it because it's not how his own ideology works. On the contrary, in fact, we can say that the liberal's ideology is a self-delusional one. It is a self-negating one. But the Marxist ideology is a self-asserting one. It's a positive one. They said, we are now Marxists. Everything is happening. Now we are Marxist. But no, the liberal is everything has happened. Now we are not something.
Right. The irony of the liberal is that uh, it only admits itself as such when when it believes it has overcome itself. It's a very interesting. Uh, it's a very fascinating admittance on their part, because it's like what they say of the American ideology. Of course, oftentimes most would not necessarily differentiate from American, quote unquote, American ideology with liberal ideology. It seems that it sees itself as to have already achieved like bias simply by like from the very start. It's arguably the only ideology where it claims to have overcome ideology from the moment it admits itself to be part of that ideology. Like, I am a liberal, therefore I have overcome bias and extreme and things like that. From the very start, it sees itself that way. Uh, not only not only and it portrays itself ironically in that regard, because the paradoxical nature of liberalism in all of its aspects, it's not just a sort of a dualistic paradox, but much more so a fragmented paradox, because it takes scenes it takes its opinions in a rather relative way, and the liberal believes that if it is relative about things, if it is loose about things, if it is a rather centrist about things, that it can somehow escape bias and extremism and um, and indoctrination, where in fact it has already, like, before you have even admitted that it has not overcome you, it has already overcome you. It is a rather tricky ideology because it, like you said, it is fundamentally a self-delusional kind of ideology, and and that's what makes it very strong and very infectious to the people who adopt it. Um, and so you see sort of denial in almost in everything, and they see this denial as a sort of affirmation of its own independence of of all um, uh, of all bigotry, when in fact it is the highest kind of bigotry, and the worst kind is always the kind that denies itself as such.
Yeah, there's also a self-denial on the Marxist side, but after the fact. Because this self-denial of the liberal is before the fact, it is a priori. And this a posteriori denial of the Marxist is when the dialectic fails. So that's why I think the Marxism died so quickly, or if we can say die quickly, but it also revives itself in many places and in many instances, is because it can always re-legitimize itself by recognizing a new form of oppression, a new uh, like a new step on the dialectic. It can always go further. So, for example, we have 1917, and Lenin claims that this is the moment, or even before that, 100 years later, before, I mean, 1850s, and when Marx claimed that now this is the moment. So, in the Marxist thought, every time is the moment uh, to have the socialist world, to have the socialist society and the communism. But if it fails, I mean, it crumbles, but it can always bring itself anew because the dialectic continues. For example, that's how we have so many Marxists in many liberal countries, and why some Marxist countries still live today is because they can still justify the dialectic, even if it had failed. Well, it was just now that we have advanced this step. So when you actually talk to a socialist, they will say no, because we used to have industry and they thought that we can have the communist society back then, but now we have machines, so and automation, so now we can have the communist society. And so that goes on and on and on and on, which is again a
Definitely.
self-delusion, but it is a posteriori. It must be a posteriori because it is a move, a step, a necessary step. Very interesting how ideologies work in their own framework.
Yes. All right, so that ends our analysis of a second film in the 1920s Soviet cinema. And to conclude our first cycle of cinematic Soviet ideology, we're going to next discuss a film by actually the teacher of Eisenstein and Pudovkin, named Lev Kuleshov. The film, of course, is a comedy film he directed in 1924 titled The Extraordinary Adventures of Mr. West in the Land of the Bolsheviks. So, if you want to see how the Soviets portrayed comedy, then look forward to the next episode and our conclusion to the first cycle of cinematic Soviet ideological films. Thank you.
Until next time.